Community, are you able to see me and hear me? Because if you are, we're going to have a little grounding chat about where we are at the beginning of the year, not just in the war, but perhaps in every aspect of everything political we care about. So we'll see where this goes. This is the first live, I think, of the year for us on the second channel. But I think we hopefully will be more regular. We've been less regular because of my health not being at all good over the last few weeks. And I'm sending love to anybody who's experiencing challenges of any kind at the moment as well. Now, let me just double check that people are seeing and hearing, and they are seeing and hearing. Wolf is saying he is watching the video by the video on this on the lovely interesting thinker Ian McGilchrist on another channel, a channel that's actually a friend of our channels. So that's wonderful. Let me just say something really banal to get us going, because I think the experience that we all have is that certainly as far as the war goes, things are a bit stuck. And there's a kind of interesting mistake we tend to make often when we think about the political future. And that mistake goes like this: we can't predict what transformational but unforeseeable events will occur. So therefore, we can assume that no unpredictable, unforeseeable transformational events will occur. And that's often, well, it's almost always wrong. But just because we can't foresee what left field things will happen doesn't mean that some won't happen. And when they happen, they might well tilt things in our favor or against our favor in ways we can't anticipate. And we're a little bit at the mercy of some such occurrences if we look at the next year, or perhaps more than just the next year, of the war. Rachel is asking, what is wrong with Jeremy Corbyn? How can somebody so good on other issues be so obtuse on Ukraine-related issues? He's not an asset to Moscow, but he's just stubborn. Well, I personally don't recommend thinking of Jeremy as a good on other issues person. And I won't get into that, but I'll just say two things, Rachel. First, it's hugely important for Americans, Canadians, Australians, Kiwis, anybody who sort of follows English language politics around the world to not conflate Jeremy Corbyn with Bernie Sanders. And there's a real tendency of that of that. So I want to warn about that. I think that it's completely consistent to be positive about one and negative about the other. The second thing I would say is that Jeremy's leadership skills are negative. In other words, he's not even a politician, let alone a leader. He's a very effective activist. I first came across him in sort of activist circles, into which I sometimes drop in, partly because of the Iraq War, partly to have a look, over 20 years ago. And Jeremy was very good at organizing stuff. But he's a pusher member of parliament, but he doesn't have leadership skills. And so even if you were to embrace his policy positions, I strongly recommend thinking that he's a political disaster. I think if he were the British Prime Minister, the degree to which he would have been co-opted into a policy on this conflict, which he wouldn't have personally liked, would have been quite high. So that's another thought. He would have adjusted to being closer to what British foreign policy anyway would be on Ukraine, irrespective of whether it's Labour, the Tories, the right of Labour, the left of Labour in power. Gen Consensus was saying that I was brewing tea and preparing my hair. Yes, as you can see, my hair took me about, takes me 30 seconds to cut my hair. Stopped going to the hairdressers a few years ago, and then just go bzzz, and I like that. Wolf, you're here. Corbyn being ripped apart as a candidate for a position of political leadership. Yes, yes, including for those who would share his, if you like, positional policy platform too. Yes. Decentralized gaming. What if Ukraine loses? Well, what does it mean for Ukraine to lose? I think that it's an important question to ask. But let's say that Ukraine losing is not the Russians taking the capital, which doesn't look like they can do, but the Russians keeping a lot of territory they've acquired, maybe even gaining a little more, and Ukraine not being incorporated into Western alliances, Ukraine being unconducive to sustainable political and economic evolution, not being conducive as an inviting place for Ukrainians who have left to return to. That would be one kind of scenario that we could call a semi-victory for Putin. In other respects, Putin's not going to win, no matter what happens. He's not going to realistically be able to take all of Ukraine. By all of Ukraine, I don't mean literally all of Ukraine, but I mean the capital, basically, and leaving Western Ukraine. That's not going to happen realistically. But this scenario is very important, and it's important. The scenario of where Putin wins or semi-wins is very important because we need to consider our own situation if that happens. What happens to the security of Western countries? And I think that here you all know what I think the big tension is. And I've laid it out extensively, so I don't want to bore you, but I think that to support Ukraine more than we're doing, we need a strategy. And to get a strategy, we need a level of capacity for cross-party solidarity on foreign policy issues that is completely unavailable in Western countries. And so you have a situation where you've got a US president who would like to support Ukraine more, but for whom Ukraine is now, let's say, not in the top two issues, the Middle East and re-election being the top two issues. So I think that this is a very, very difficult problem, but we've got to admit the reality here of our, what I call democratic capacity, our capacity to develop a clear strategic vision being so diminished by the flailing state of our democracies. So I argue no strategy, no more support for Ukraine, no escalation and no sustenance of sound support for Ukraine. And so what I don't see is an approach that says, well, forget about any strategy. Let's just send more weapons and more cash. So I don't believe you're going to get that. In other words, you're either going to get nothing extra and just a diminution of support, or you're going to get a strategy, and only via that strategy will more follow. And the strategy is an understanding of what we're doing and why, and what kind of picture of the world it forms into. But the challenge for a strategy is that there are so many things about our domestic politics that make it virtually impossible. Now, you have to work in the realm of the impossible in politics. And when someone says impossible to solve a problem, your response should be, well, okay, if there are some roads that can't be taken, are there any alleyways, any side tracks we can explore to get a part of the result we're looking for? And could we make 1% progress on those? So when we say something like we don't have the democratic capacity to develop a strategy, we're not saying something utterly static. Now, at the same time, got to be realistic in not postulating that we can arrive at destinations that require us flying when our wings are broken. So we don't want to do that. But at the same time, we don't want to be simply static about this. And I do think that admitting the nature of the obstacles we face increases our chances of partially overcoming some of them. So that's what we are. That's what we're looking at, and we've got this rather bizarre discourse at the moment where the expert community says, "Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, help Ukraine more," and then politicians say, "Oh yeah, we hear you, we hear you, we hear you, we hear you," whereas in reality, helping Ukraine is an issue of some priority, but not of overwhelming priority. And it's an issue that could endanger other important aspirations, right? There's a tension between democratic stability and helping Ukraine, in my opinion. Now, I'm aware of what all the polls in all the Western countries say about how there is still a lot of support among citizens for their governments to stand with Ukraine. But nevertheless, I think that there is a significant degree of democratic self-endangerment in politicians who push for support for Ukraine hard. And that's going to put a limit on what they're going to be open to do. I also think that we need a public debate that is much more about the mechanics of what's stopping us rather than abstract ideas about what's so good about supporting Ukraine. I'm reading a lot of so what articles at the moment where somebody puts something in, somebody I like or even know and have favorable views about, puts an article in the New York Times or the Guardian, and I read it and I say, well, that's good. That really is the advantage of supporting Ukraine for us. But what's stopping us? In the mechanics of that are absent, and so we just end up, repeating arguments without discussing why the social power of these arguments seems so diminished, even though they seem to, on the face of it, make a lot of sense. So I think we need more of a conversation about the mechanics of change, and I think that requires more honesty about where our politicians really are, and that is to say that, quite frankly, most people in Western Europe in positions of power do not see Putin as an existential threat to them. And this is a very interesting debate what is Putin's intent and can he be stopped? Can he stop without being stopped? And I've shared lots of views about that. But the point is also that we've just got to start with where our politicians really are. And there is a gap there between actions and real private positions. Um, and that's a big divide between folks in the eastern parts of Europe and folks in France or Germany. And so all of this we've got to be really honest about. Pavel is asking, how often do you think Putin runs through his head the scenario of him having to deliberate the choice of putting the nuclear button? How proper is his relationship to this power of his, would you say? I think less now, because Putin probably thinks he's in an even better position than he is in, and he is in a tolerable position as far as we can see. So less now. Now, what's happened is that the Putin regime has rather stabilized itself. And we can see that with 2 years of war, with a lack of imminent economic danger to the country, with a lack of capacity for short to medium term asphyxiation of Russia via the sanctions that we've shown, with Mr. Prigozhin supplied with ammunition finally, and Mr. Girkin in jail, with an election quote unquote campaign now, which is really about, is this going to go smoothly for me, or am I going to experience some kind of turbulence? But even if that happens, it won't be existential for me. So that's how Putin sees things. I think that's to a good extent, at least as far as the list I've just given now, fairly accurate. And because of that, I think that the nuclear situation is um, much less on the table now. But I think that there's a certain sacredness about places we don't want to go. And I think that what's happened in the Putin regime is that the sacredness around nuclear use has been broken. And so what they've got is a capacity to sort of talk about it that increases the risk of them using nuclear weapons under certain circumstances, none of which are really on the table now. But this business of sacredness is very important. I mean, we know in the West about the sacredness of um, democratic procedure, right? When we put into question the sacredness of democratic institutions once or twice, that sacredness can't be recreated. If a prime minister or president disobeys a court, let's say, that irretrievably hurts a democracy. Or if we sort of march on a political institution and break inside it, that also does irreparable damage to our sense that we can't just manipulate this stuff as we please. The next video on the main channel is going to be about the breakup of Russia. There's a sacredness there too, that once you begin moving the borders of your country, which is what Putin has done, that undermines that sense of sacredness that a country's borders have. So Putin invaded Ukraine. He had war on Ukrainian territory, which he orchestrated. And then, together with his gang, he simply took a decision to migrate that war onto Russian territory by labeling Ukraine as Russia in part. And when that was formalized, that broke a degree of sacredness that applies to the country's sense of its own borders, making other borders of Russia much more likely to start floating. And the same with nuclear use. We want to keep even certain questions about it a taboo, and that's what the Russian regime doesn't do. Now, that might not dramatically change nuclear risk, but I think it changes it somewhat. And the nuclear risk that I'm personally concerned about this regime elevating is not small-scale nuclear use, but a strategic nuclear exchange. As far as strategic nuclear exchange goes, the Putin regime is a bigger risk than the Soviet regimes were in my assessment. But I think right now, this isn't much of a conversation simply because the Putin regime feels stable. But if and when they're losing and they're desperate, that conversation uh, will return. Um, but what I'm saying shouldn't be overestimated. It's not that there are a bunch of maniacs ready to blow up the world. It's rather that there's a modicum of normalization around nuclear use and a modicum of, I would say, apocalyptic thinking about it. And that could tilt, let's be facetious here and use a number, even though that's a silly thing to do, that could tilt global nuclear risk by 10%. In the wrong direction if a situation of dramatic escalation arises in the next few years. That's how to answer that question. Sebastian is saying the more time we waste in the West messing around, not supporting Ukraine, the more Putin has time to mobilize the military industry and the population. The military industry, yes. The population, no. The key message is still, please stay out of politics. I mean, notice that the supporters of Putin who are more hardcore than Putin and become opponents of Putin by being fervent supporters of the hardcore version of Putin, Girkin and Prigozhin, have disappeared. Right? These trends on the Z side will reappear again, but they've disappeared. So even pro-Putin mobilization is scary for the regime. Having said this, they are also, and this is a very important part of what you're saying that needs to be acknowledged, they are also trying to mobilize the population while trying to demobilize it. And what's striking about 2024 is that the positive urge in the Kremlin to continue demobilizing the population remains really high. And their anxiety about mobilization, political mobilization of the population remains really high. But at the same time, they are trying to mobilize the population. They are trying to uh, say, well, why don't these people want to stand up and battle with NATO in Ukraine? Um, and I think that we're going to get some evolutions in that balance toward mobilization after the election. Ian is asking, is any part of the Russian Federation likely to break away? Well, there's a difference between peeling at the edges and breaking away. I think I can preempt myself here and say peeling at the edges is probably likely. About breaking away completely into smithereens, you're going to have to watch my video that's coming soon on the main channel, where I try to give a really good concentrated account of how I recommend us to start exploring that question. At the moment, if you Google the question, you're going to run into two brick walls. One says, or maybe several brick walls. One says, it's impossible, it's inconceivable that Russia breaks up. And if you raise the question, it shows you're not serious. That's the first wall you run into. The second wall you run into, it's inevitable. Russia's breakup is inevitable. Russia is on life support, and eventually that will be taken away with the military defeat, and that'll be it. The country will break up. And then there is a third group that's it's not about whether it will or won't happen, but that it should happen. You're going to run into these brick walls, and it can be really difficult. I suppose you can say, well, look, these people are activists and they evidently don't know anything about Russia. So let's put it like this: 95% of the discourse that says that Russia will break up is total BS in the sense that these people haven't got a clue what they're talking about. And you ask them 3 or 4 questions, immediately everything they say will collapse. But it doesn't mean they're not accidentally right. Um, so um, what I'll try to do in the video is, first of all, talk about the motivations of these different factions, and then try to look at what would need to be in place for the breakup to happen. Like, what are the factors that would be needed on the ground for that to happen, and are they there? We'll go through these factors. But I'm uncomfortable with the discourse about this, which says it's an absurd thing to even raise, on the one hand, and on the other hand, says that it's inevitable. Um, Now, I don't think that serious people who say it's inevitable mean it's literally inevitable, because nothing in history is inevitable, because history isn't a science, and you can't predict or retrodict the future, or you can't predict or retrodict historical events in accordance with anything that is particularly exact or generalizable or universalizable. Um, but I think what people who say it's inevitable really mean is that, well, as far as the obvious social sources that we kind of can see, that's the scenario that most makes sense. That's what they really mean. And we'll try to juxtapose that against the view that it's just ridiculous to even raise the question, because it's just there's no indication of anything trending in that direction. And I'll try to arbitrate between these two views a bit in that video. And I am a useful source for this, because emotionally, I don't have a horse in the race. I don't identify sufficiently as a Russian to. I mean, I never like violence and calamity, but if you ask me to sort of wave a magic wand and create a peacefully segregated Russia, that sort of wouldn't be against my dispositions and preferences in any way. Whereas, of course, for Russian citizens, typically it would, of course, because they want to keep their country together. But is it all Russian citizens? What about the different national republics? What about all the ethnic groups? There we'll talk about all of that. But I don't emotionally have a horse in the race of saying that Russia as a political entity must be preserved. So I think it'll be an easy conversation from that point of view for me to have. But I look forward to sharing it with you. And what I might do is make that video on the main channel, but then share a longer sort of footnotes and questions driven chat about the breakup after, and then hopefully we'll have a good grounding, because I do think that for the average sort of spectator of the debate, it's confusing, because the debate just breaks into these paths that do not communicate with each other. Anyway. Let's have a look. Wes G was saying a question disappeared. I'm sorry if it disappeared. Wasn't anything I did. Let's have a look. Cosmic is asking about the body bag threshold. There are thresholds in Russia. it's hard to know what they are. I don't think the body bag threshold is one of them. In other words, I have the view that depending on how other things go, Russia could tolerate 5x the body bags they've had so far. So they're going to run into different kinds of friction. But I think that without other kinds of friction, creating crises, just elevation of casualty numbers will not be enough of a problem, especially if these casualties are part of a force that isn't rotated, where a lot of the population can say, well, you've taken these folks away and they're going to be just ground down until they're ground down. They're not going to be returned and replaced with others. So I think that if anything, it's not directly casualties, but future waves of mobilization that could have a destabilizing effect. But casualty numbers in of themselves in a radically depoliticized society where the casualties are still a relatively small fragment of the population in the scheme of anything you can think of in relatively recent Russian history, that's not, for me, going to be something that I'd be optimistic about happening. In other words, the tolerance there is so high potentially that we haven't reached even a quarter of what the upper limit would be, in my view, sadly. Michael is asking a question about a democratic uprising in China. It's dangerous for me to comment because I know less about China than I do about Russia by a very large margin. Having said this, it's healthy to be reminded that when we talk about China, we are talking about a kind of dictatorship sitting atop an enormous population. So we shouldn't equate the Chinese people with the Chinese regime. But certainly, as far as anything I am seeing, I'm particularly skeptical about democratic turns in China anytime in the medium, let alone the short term future. Papa is saying Vlad seems to be speaking more and more of Russian talking points. So far during this video, I've counted 7 Russian talking points. Even before this video, I've seen this trend. So this is a very, very important uh, uh, misalignment of how to engage with politics. It's what I call a signals-based way of engaging with politics. That's to say, you're not looking at intent. You're not looking at substance. You're looking at certain kinds of signals that, on the basis of which you then begin sort of categorizing people into whether they are with you or with a certain project or against you or against a certain project. Now, the effect of what that is a special kind of challenge that we all face, which is something I've just written a post about on the main channel community page, which is depoliticization, and it's a dangerous trend in domestic politics because it takes away power from us. And it's a obviously also a very dangerous trend um, as far as the Russo-Ukrainian war is concerned, because you end up drifting away from substance. What are the threats the Putin regime poses? What is going to be the impact on us and Western democracies? What challenges Ukraine face? What needs does Ukraine have? You are um, not just sort of at risk of converting discourse into um, instrumental toys to support a particular picture, often very shallow and contradictory and sort of fleeting social media constructed picture. You're also simply just um, weaponizing ideas, and not even weaponizing the substance of the ideas, but weaponizing the surface of the ideas. And you should pay attention to the substance, not the surface. And neither with the case of nor one nor the other should you weaponize them, and I'm afraid that is what your comment has done. So imagine um, that I said that the war the war looks like it's stuck at the moment. Imagine I said to myself, well, that is a Kremlin talking point, so I shouldn't say that. I mean, imagine how silly, how embarrassing that looks, right? Once you begin exploring what you've written, and that it's precisely what you've written that constitutes the kind of depoliticization that endangers Western citizens, um, because while you pay attention to the signals instead of the substance, you could lose your democracy and not even notice. Then it's going to be too late. So this is very, very dangerous, very, very dangerous sort of weaponization, gamification of discourse. Um, and I quite frankly couldn't recommend against it strongly enough. That's not criminal to do it. Nobody's going to come and sort of, get you or steal your lunch because you're doing it. Um, but it's super unhealthy. And in terms of what helps Ukraine, if you want to just proceed in those terms, well, obviously my answer helps Ukraine much more than your comment, obviously, because it engages with the real issues involved. Sorry for the sort of 6.2 out of 10 brutality of the answer. I could have gone 4. I mean, the other thing is that the bloody Russians are weaponizing everything, and we don't want to be like them. Like your analysis, the referrer is saying, "Thank you. Do you think the world is a safer place now? Russia has shown that it is weaker than most thought, and Europe understands that defense is important." I'm afraid not. I'm afraid that while we're not this month or even this slot of a 6-month period in a particularly elevated dynamic of nuclear risk, I think that we are in a historical period of nuclear risk greater than at any time in the last 50 years. And I think that a um, a weak Russia that is in the middle of a sort of feverish revanchist imperialist project is a danger, even if we, as the West, would outmatch it dramatically in resource, in um, economic scale, in quantity and size of weaponry. I do think that the Putin regime is a significant global threat, I'm afraid. Um, Now, my belief is that if we cut off help from Ukraine today, that threat that the Putin regime poses would grow, it wouldn't diminish. If we gave them a deal that take. And the only deal they take is one that probably allowed them to delay and perpetuate further war. It's a difficult situation for us because a losing Russia does present a nuclear risk, and a losing Russia that is nevertheless allowed to continue escalate without being challenged also presents nuclear risk. There's a very difficult balance for us to deal with. And um, as far as other issues go, I believe the main global challenge is, as single issues go, is the climate crisis, and apart from that, a kind of multi-issue challenge. Climate crisis is that too. It affects everything. It'll multiply war, migration patterns, and so on dramatically. But I think something else that's true is that the West is not just in retreat to some extent. Um, it's in, if you like, conceptual retreat. The West doesn't have a picture of the kind of world that it wants to see. And so it can't work for that world because it doesn't have a picture of it. And so all of these things are challenging. But how bad is it depends on your sense of historical perspective. I think the moment we're in is not that bad if you look at it in the scheme of the last century. But if you look at it in a scheme of life from 1991 till 2010, then we're in a much more chaotic, anarchic, senseless, and volatile moment. So we're coming out of a certain period of not just our democracies being in the bay, but the global order being in the bay to some extent. But I don't recommend catastrophizing this because our democracies were in sync and the world were in sync. But that kind of cushioned experience, relatively speaking, there was so much wrong with the world still, but that cushioned experience that we had in the West, at least from the early 1990s until a few years into this century, perhaps the first decade of this century, that is irreversibly gone. And we're going to have to wake up to the fact that we're not ready for some of the challenges we're facing, and we're not strategizing about some of the challenges we're facing. So we're not going to sink, but the waters are choppy at home in our democracies and on the global stage. So that's my answer. For anybody scared about nuclear risk, I actually think this community tends to be not scared about nuclear risk because you all think, well, let's get those Russians. Um, and nuclear risk cannot just go up overnight. It's something that requires a series of escalatory steps, and so if that starts happening, we're all going to know it. Jacob is sending love back, and wishing you a happy 2024 too. And so kind of you to wish well for my health challenges, and I redirect that to anybody in the community who has health challenges. Nancy, thank you so much. SL, when will the mothers of the mobilized in Russia say enough is enough? They are treading a very fine line, if you're going to categorize them, between saying we don't like this, but not really criticizing the war or the Putin regime. And what one has to understand is that up to a point, protest is tolerable for the regime if it is not criticizing the regime and if it does not contradict the regime's central policies. I think you could cast the mothers of the mobilized as not criticizing the regime, but it's not clear whether you can cast them as not criticizing a significant policy of the regime, which is the brutal invasion of Ukraine. So um, we're going to have to see how this goes. But so far, as I've been following it as much as I can from outside, and referring to experts who follow it with greater nuance than I can, I don't see anything explosive there at the moment. Um, but I think what we're seeing is this kind of balance. Um, what we're seeing is this kind of balance, and between saying this and that is out of order, but stopping short of criticizing the war itself and Putin. Let's have a look. I'm a bit slower today, and I'm so grateful that you're staying with me. I hope to be a little bit sharper, fresher next time. Martin is asking what will happen if Trump wins. I think one of the biggest concepts to deploy is the concept of co-option. I mean, we always talk about power corrupting, but also, as a wonderful philosophical colleague of mine wrote, I think in a book in the early 80s called After Virtue, um, ap- power co-opts and absolute power co-opts absolutely. So we're going to, if Trump gets elected, which is still today, I would say is the single most likely outcome, unfortunately, and I I strongly have the view that that would be unfortunate because Trump is an anti-democratic political actor. But I think that there would be a degree of co-option. But how much co-option there would be, we don't know. What we do know is that Trump is conscious that he got co-opted in the first term quite a lot. And he is keen to avert that happening a second time. He wants to take revenge on uh, a system and an environment that rather pushed him over the first time round. The reason he got pushed over is because, partly through his own deficiencies as a communicator of genius, he is a political actor of bewildering incompetence at the same time. And he just did not have the chops to begin building an elite, which is the sort of thing that Putin and Orban would have been doing in Trump's case. So he remained a one-man show, um, and he got somewhat washed out by the um, checks and balances of the US political system. And he wants to make sure that doesn't happen as much the second time round. So we're going to have to see. Now, that cartoonishly means it's probably not as catastrophic for Ukraine as the most catastrophic prognosis suggests if Trump gets elected. But it's bad, really, really bad, and also bad for Western democracy. And if the United States essentially switches off its taps to Ukraine, Europe cannot pick up the pieces. Realistically, it's not going to happen. Arestovych interview on Unheard. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I watched about 20 minutes of it. I can't comment on it because I don't haven't followed closely enough Arestovich's evolution over the last 6 months or so, or even a year. He's evolved quite a lot. Um, he is a somewhat egomaniacal character who has enormous gifts and the capacity for sound elements of analysis, but he does not necessarily have the capacity to be an entirely constructive actor. Put put it put it mildly. What I can't do is comment on his evolution in detail recently, because that would have required me to follow them more closely. What I will say is that this year will be the year of politicization in Ukraine. There's going to be more people saying more things that are critical. And so my advice to Ukrainians always about Arestovych, if they ask it, is that the point isn't to cancel Arestovych, but to have more people in the public sphere engaging in constructive discourse, both about what Ukraine is, where it's going, and what it means for Ukraine now to sustainably take on the challenges it is facing this year, which is, of course, the situation at the front, and then how that relates to um, Ukraine's military-industrial complex and what it needs to do, to Ukraine's economy, and to Ukraine's civic discourse, which needs to, but is inevitably going to widen with the war in the prolonged state it's entered now. So there's going to be more and more Ukrainians saying different things and critical things. And it's about squaring that degree of, if you like, demobilization at the level of discourse with a firm level of mobilization as far as anything to do with the physical security of the country goes, because it's going to be continuing engaging in a war with to hold off the country's brutal invasion by the Putin regime. Jim's talking about third-party candidates. If the United States gets to that in America, if the United States gets to that, it's not going to be. It's not looking like it's going to be now. It remains very strongly a two-party system. Donald Person is asking, will Putin get into a war with the USA? If you're talking about a hot war with the USA, the answer is probably not. But it's a possibility, and we've got to consider that very seriously, and also consider how we minimize that. Jor is asking a question a lot of you are not going to like, and I don't love it, but let's look at it. Dear Vlad, do you think the American political environment is similar to Putin's Russia? Democrats are using the justice system to attempt to stop a political opponent. No, I happen to think that the attempt to stop Trump by more by legal than by political means is unconstructive, and it's neither good nor effective. But there's no comparison, because if there were a comparison, then Donald Trump would be uh, in Mr. Navalny's position. Instead, he is the single most likely individual to be the next president of the United States. Right? Now, my own categorization of Trump, I'm sorry if you're a Trump supporter and I'm zinging you, but it's important to state this. My own characterization of Trump is as an anti-democratic, uh, exclusionary populist who also takes the typical form of such a creature on the global stage today, which is the form of buffoonery. But here is your difference. Remote jail somewhere in the north versus the single most likely person to win an election. So no, there's absolutely no comparison. And despite the condition of our democracies, there's still an enormous amount we've got going for ourselves. And there is enormous virtue, not just in us trying to make things better, but in not losing some of the stuff that we have. We've got to be. Neil is asking, how is Trump exclusionary? Trump is exclusionary insofar as he does not include all citizens in his discourse. It's an us versus them discourse. Now, you might say that all populists are like that, and I would say no, they're not. Let's take the example of the populist Bernie Sanders. Let's be neutral about Bernie's project, whether it's amazing or total disaster. Bernie is an inclusive populist. He does think of all Americans. In my view, he does not do us versus them. I'm not approving of Bernie's project or criticizing it here. I'm being neutral about that. Neil is saying wrong. But yeah, Bernie's sort of let's go out and get some of the forces that are creating some of the things that he perceives as significant injustices and challenges, does not lead him to do us versus them in his discourse. So you can be an inclusive populist. Juncker is talking about the Budapest Memorandum. Yes, it's a very, very weak. I think I discussed it in one of my videos. Mary Surratt is one of the wonderful experts to refer to in this. It's a very, very weak, very, very weak agreement that was never going to protect Ukraine. Heater is asking, have the Brits gone soft? I grew up in England, no central heating. Then I remember scraping ice off the inside of my bedroom window. I don't think the Brits have gone soft, but I would submit that maybe some people in here in Bethnal Green, where I live, have gone soft. And if something utterly extraordinary happened, like a collapse of the state, they would freak out, at least at first, the way that other generations and citizens in other parts of the country wouldn't. But having said this, humans are limitlessly adaptable and extraordinarily resilient. So even the most pretentious person in this part of London who thinks that who dresses like they work in a workshop, where in fact they don't, within 2 weeks would adjust to some kind of existential reality and then be quite similar to others. It's extraordinary how fast resilience emerges in people under extreme circumstances. Even the most fluffy people. That's one feature that is quite universal in human beings: resilience. I mean, some people have really poor, um, physical constitution. Some people have screwed up brain chemistry, challenging mental health. But at the level of resilience, when you put pressure on them, it's amazing how resilient human beings are all over the world, even in the most spoiled, um, sort of little micro pockets of privileged bits of the West. And I don't want to exaggerate how many such places there are. There's massive disadvantage and inequality just in London around me too. Um, but yeah, humans are resilient. So maybe they've gone soft, but if um, things hit the fan, um, uh, hello Evie, if things hit the fan, eventually they'll wake up. Chris is saying it'd be nice if people got chance to be softened. Yes, but unfortunately we're moving into a world where there's going to be just a little bit less elbow room and things are going to be a bit more brutal than they were, I'm afraid. Greetings back to you in Ontario. Am I on your blacklist or just very consistent with bad questions? I'll ask something which is, how does a path to politicization differ for ethnic Russians and minorities? What Russia has is a gap where there should be a question and an answer. And the question is, what holds all of us together on this territory? And the answer is X, Y, Z. When Putin's imperial project self-immolates, there will be the space for that question to arise. And the question you're asking goes to the heart of what the answer to that question is. It may be that there isn't a difference. And that's a scenario. There's always going to be difference, but maybe there isn't a fundamental difference. And that's a scenario of Russia, if you like, federalizing, decentralizing, um, but not splitting up. So the demand for federalization is fairly strong across ethnic divides in Russia. There's a subtle, suppressed feeling. You saw it in Bashkortostan again recently. What on earth is going on? Why is Moscow parachuting people to run our lives for us? What kind of insanity is this? That is strongly felt by a lot of Russians across the political spectrum. And even the depoliticized people feel that. If that ends up being satisfied by certain modes of decentralization, then there may not be a vast divide. There's going to be still some divides because ethnic groups in Russia want more respect. They want more recognition. They want more space to breathe. They want more respect for their culture, more recognition of their languages, as opposed to suppression, which is what they've been getting. And the instinct of the Putin regime is always suppress, 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 clamp down, clamp down. So you're going to react differently if that's your culture being stamped upon. But that difference isn't going to be fundamental if part of the conversation, but what holds all of this stuff together is an answer that says that, well, we need decentralization. And within that, we'll work out who we are and how we all coexist on this territory. But if Russia is to splinter, then there could be more of a difference between how ethnic minority groups and ethnic Russians see things. Having said this, if you take somebody like Alexander Etkind, who is probably as famous as any proponent of not the good or bad of Russia splitting, but of the likelihood of it, he does not think that ethnic divisions will be the driving force of the splitting, actually. So that's part of the answer. It's going to be manifested by the history that takes place at a stage when Russia runs into the question, what holds all of this stuff together? And then there's people going to be giving answers, potentially. And some answers are going to be destructive, some constructive, and some answers are going to appear constructive but prove destructive as well. We are seeing at the moment very little positive mobilization for secession in Russia. But don't forget, Russia is a country without political views. So Russia is a country where political views will appear once political action becomes perceived to be possible. So that's why it's completely wrong to go around, as every article, just about every article in the West does, speculating about what Russians think. That's an elementary sociological error. That's to say, they're gonna, as it were, begin operating in the political space which they come to perceive as available, which they don't at the moment, and then they're going to develop views. But on all of that, much more, I think, precisely, I'll touch in the main channel video on the possibility of Russia's breakup. Tim is asking, is Putin reserving the Siloviki and young men of Moscow and Petersburg for his endgame in Ukraine? No, Putin's endgame is not in Ukraine. Putin's endgame is with some kind of fracturing, fragmentation, and weakening in the West that allows Putin to impose his demands on us, either simply by making these demands or by engaging in some kind of zigzag or geostrategic provocation outside of Ukraine. By the way, if Putin has any single fear that is the worst fear after being overthrown Gaddafi style, it is the breakup of Russia. Putin is pathologically terrified of the breakup of Russia. And funnily enough, the factor that, however unlikely or likely you might think it is, and I'll legislate on that a bit in the main channel video, but whatever the odds of Russia's breakup, and right this minute they're not looking great, but that could change. But whatever the odds, the key, if you like, inadvertent protagonist of that outcome is Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin is the main likely cause of that, if that is to happen. Cheryl, I bought a book today. You're asking about the capacity of ethnic minorities in Russia to protest. I bought a book today that is um, uh, only for geeks, because it's one of those books that really only libraries should buy. But it's called it's edited by Jeremy Morris, I think, and it's called something like, I can't look it up now. It's called Modalities of Political Activism in Russia, or something like that. Um, and it looks at ethnic group activism and protest. Um, what you, I think, well, we'll talk about this again in the breakup video, but what we've got to recognize is that that distinction applies very strongly, um, which is the distinction the regime makes between acceptable and not acceptable protest. So is this protest against us or against one of our key policies? So if Russians are protesting because their heating is not working, the regime accepts that as legitimate. But any kind of protest for ethnic group rights always runs the risk of being seen as a foreign sponsored attempt at destabilization. And today, Russia is little by little moving from suppressing not just direct opposition, but indirect opposition or heterodoxy of various kinds. And in Russia, it is extremely difficult to mobilize politically. The state does everything instrumentally, but also culturally, to prevent people from mobilizing. So, in many ways, the possibility for finding out what the different members of ethnic groups in Russia feel about what politics they want, that's only going to happen if a little bit more oxygen appears for them to act. So that is going to have to be part of that conversation that occurs on that space in the future about what that space is and what holds it all together. I would say that with ethnic groups in Russia, the age divide will often be greater as a political factor than their ethnicity. And the urban versus not quite rural, but the urban versus the much less urban divide may also be that. For many people who are members of various ethnic groups. But we're going to find out more about that in the future because all of this stuff is stuck underground. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of this in the next few weeks because we're going to be focusing on this topic. Victor is asking, how likely is it that Yeltsin would have made another Putin-like figure in the next election? Well, there's a tiny video on the philosophy channel about what difference individuals make in history. And there's, I think, a wrong tendency to think that while individuals make a big difference, they make no difference when it comes to the big events. And I think they do, of course, make a big difference when it comes to big events. So I think that Yeltsin would not have been Putin, and a lot of the other people that were candidates to take over at that point would not have become a Putin. Um, you don't want to be facetious about this, and deny various ways that Russia was trending away from democracy when Yeltsin was still in power. Um, but nevertheless, no, Yeltsin is not Putin. But anybody who stayed that long at the top of a fluid mafia-like authoritarian regime would lose their monitors to planet Earth to some degree, inevitably, even if it was just the average person in our room right now. So Yeltsin, if his health were good, would have been a complete calamity if he'd stayed in power that long as well. But yes, Yeltsin had. You don't want to overestimate personal qualities, but Yeltsin had a sense of responsibility for the country that Putin never had. And Yeltsin had some democratic sensibilities, of which Putin didn't just have none. He was skeptical of whether they were even a thing. So yes, we would have been in a different place, without doubt. But you don't want to just reduce it to the role of the individual. There were many other systemic factors that were going to make the country trend in a disastrous direction. Do I think Prigozhin escaped? My strong assumption is that Prigozhin is not with us and has received ammunition. Yeah, Donald saying Putin's never understood democracy. I do think that one of the things that, and I've been following the Putin regime since the 90s and closely, one of the points that's frustrated me often in Western commentary is the thought that Putin is making things up. That, of course, he believes in democracy, but he's just a calculating tyrant who doesn't want to have anything to do with democracy. And or that Putin is pretending to be ventilated about NATO, but isn't really. And it's very important to understand the sincerity of a lot of Putin's positions. And one of his sincere positions is that the concept of political opposition is just unavailable. If you're a political opponent, you're an enemy. Shannon, good morning in Arizona. If you're a political opponent, you're just an enemy, which is why when Putin is moving Mr. Navalny now from one remote prison to an even more remote prison, Mr. Navalny being the main political prisoner in the country, Putin sees that as him moving an agent the United States tried to insert into Russian politics to destabilize Putin's rule. And he's thinking, well, you put that stuff in, well, enjoy how your agent is wheeled around on trains around the country. Enjoy. And that's because the concept of being a political opponent is unavailable to Putin. The political opponent is somebody who is working against you, but within the constraints of a shared enterprise of cooperation. So I'm working against you on the tennis court, but I'm doing a second serve and I want it to go in. And I'm obviously not going to start throwing potatoes at you, or try to chase you away from the court, or throw you in the lake. That is not what I'm going to do if we're playing tennis. I want you to lose, but I only want you to lose within the rules of the game. I don't want to break the game, because if I broke the game, I couldn't beat you. So that's the idea that cooperation within a shared enterprise is a central element of um, the politics of political opposition. The politics of political opposition is a politics also where we can be opponents today but allies tomorrow. But for Mr. Putin, you're either not a political opponent, um, or if you are one, you're automatically an enemy. And when we do our tennis court in the West, and now we're getting worse at this, we're treating each other like political enemies too, and we should be political opponents. But when we still manage to do this to some extent in the West, Putin sees that as a kind of a facade that's see-through, that is not real, and is a kind of game. And insofar as it is real, it's not going to last. And so that's how he sees it. So it's just not real. So I think that's very important. I'm not sure you're aware, therefore, how significant the comment you've made is. Um, it's not just a light observation, it's a profound truth. 10:24 in Arizona, 5:24, 5:26 now on this island. Cat, greetings in Chicago. Hugs back your way. General consensus is offering some logic. Let's see if we can help. Maybe we can't. The Russians say that Ukrainians have no separate identity, that they're just Russians gone bad under this Satanist external influence. So Americans are Russians gone bad. That doesn't compute. So I think that, let's not play the logic games. I'm just going to give the straight answer, if that's okay. So Putin's distinction is of our stuff and not our stuff. And his view about all of Eastern Europe is sort of an our stuff view. Yes, the United States has done NATO there. And yes, European Union has done European Union there. But it's not their stuff, it's our stuff. And our stuff doesn't mean it has to be part of Russia. It just means it has to be under our influence. And it's under our influence because even if it's not ours proper, it's more ours than theirs. That's an important distinction. About everything that's in Western Europe, Putin doesn't have such thoughts. He thinks that these are generally outsiders that Russia doesn't need to have any control over. So while Putin's sort of borderlessness and imperialism is rather leaky, his idea that there are people on his side that are betraying him is not completely it's completely leaky. It stops at a certain point, probably with East Germany. He's not going to go around saying that France is somehow going to be part of Russia. So that's the Europe and North America picture that Putin has. As far as Ukraine goes, there's a series of tensions there. I mean, the Kremlin genocidal narrative has been that Ukrainians don't exist. But I think that there are other narratives involved too. And I think there is a small place for a narrative that does perceive Ukrainians as just inferior and other. But I think preponderantly, you're right, they're not seen as other, they're seen as Russians who've forgotten they're Russian. But that business, you're with us, but you've forgotten that you're with us, takes different forms and isn't sort of an endless chain. So the story, you're really us, but you've forgotten that applies to Ukraine. But it doesn't apply to Poland. Poland is not us, it's just our sphere of influence. So there is us, there is our sphere of influence, and then there is the world we do not deserve any propriety over, and that's the West. Miko's asking me, do I anticipate already see moves in Europe to unite against the Russian threat? I'm afraid that there's two thoughts here, really. Europe is facing a big question about whether it needs to rethink its defense policy and its military industrial capacity. And there is a conflict about that. And the conflict about whether the Putin regime is an appropriate enough threat to do that. But beyond that, there's disagreement and or a lack of coherent understanding of how to approach the Putin threat. So there's a lack of an understanding of how to approach it, lack of strategy, and also a lack of agreement about the seriousness of the threat, right? It feels existential in Eastern Europe. It doesn't feel existential in Western centers of power. I have my own views about that I've shared. So no, I'm afraid I don't see the West coming together and mobilizing either economically and militarily against the Putin regime, or mobilizing at the level of a coherent strategy about what to do about this. And I attribute some of this incapacity to what I call a lack of democratic capacity. That our democracies, as soon as they begin to act, begin sort of treading water or begin getting stuck in the mud with the wheels going, but no distance being covered. But let's not catastrophize this. I mean, we will not let Putin take over Ukraine's capital. We will not let Putin, in all likelihood, break Ukraine's independence. But do we have a strategy for a victory there? We don't. General consensus is asking, even delusional Russians know they cannot defeat NATO. I'm going to push back against that, because that's not a correct understanding of what they're thinking in the Kremlin. Nobody's thinking that they're going to defeat NATO in a big war. And this is the last video on the main channel is about this. They're not thinking they're going to defeat NATO in a big war. They're thinking they're going to prod and provoke NATO into a kind of slow folding away, a kind of slow self dismantling by conceivably, I'm not saying that's likely, I think it's unlikely, but it's possible, by, for instance, challenging Article 5 in respect of a NATO member that isn't one NATO will end up standing up for. And Putin thinks that's just not true of the world today, but he thinks a world may come about where you could challenge Article 5 effectively. So what Putin's thinking about is not a big war with NATO. He's thinking of a war with NATO in some technical sense, conflict with NATO, but he's not thinking about an all-out war. He's rather thinking a weakened NATO, a West in division and democratic decline that is just not going to mobilize when NATO is challenged. And when that test comes and it's not met by NATO, NATO becomes a relatively irrelevant alliance because of its demonstrated incapacity. That is Putin's plan, insofar as he has one. It's not something he's definitely going to do. It's something that is available on the horizon if circumstances arise for it. So, I'm seeing a lot of people going around in a sort of rather triumphalist way saying, well, how is he going to do a war against NATO? He's stuck in southeastern Ukraine. Sure, that's not the plan. The plan is that we are so weak that we're going to be too divided to stand up to him, not that he's going to beat us in a big war. That's the Kremlin. That's the potential upper limit of Kremlin escalation, I would say. So we've reached 1.5 hours. I've been very grateful to have you all with me. Um, and we're going to talk soon. And those of you who haven't been on the main channel, make sure in a few days to check it. I'll let you know when that's going to happen because there's going to be something new there. Finally, happy, peaceful Sunday to everybody. Sending my love and thank you so much for being with me.